I'm David Lombardino, Editor-in-Chief of DLA Editors and Proofers, here to talk to you today about a question that comes up frequently for us, which is whether it is plagiarism to have a paper, essay, dissertation, thesis, or capstone project edited. And the answer is simple. Well, what is it that the editing is doing? Because editing can either create plagiarism in a paper or it can eliminate it. Now, generally speaking, we understand that plagiarism is taking somebody else's work and presenting it as your own. But it goes a little further than that. It also involves making sure that the appropriate credit, the right kind of credit, is given to whatever source you have used to get that content. And so we can think of plagiarism in a few different ways. So one way, of course, is if somebody writes something and you reproduce it word for word in your paper. And you don't quote it, you don't cite the source, you don't make any reference to where you got that from. Of course, that is plagiarism. And a good editor is going to go in there and say, look, you need to quote this and you need to reference it, or you need to paraphrase it, or you need to remove it from your paper. And that brings us to the second form of plagiarism, which is paraphrasing. Paraphrasing is when you take somebody else's words, what somebody else has written, and you reformulate it into your own words and then put it forward as your own. Of course, still then giving credit to that person, but using your own words. And the way that paraphrasing can be plagiarism is if your own wording is not significantly different or notably different from the original author and in your own voice. And a great example of that is if you have your paper and your paper establishes you use a certain voice for your paper throughout, and then you get to where you're paraphrasing something from someone else, what somebody else has written. And then there's a shift in the voice, even if you've changed a few of the words from the original quote. Well, that shift in voice represents plagiarism because it's not significantly, it's not notably your own voice. And so what your editor should do there is either say, hey, look, you need to re-paraphrase this or rework this, rewrite it so that it is in your own voice, or just go back to the original wording, copy it word for word, put quotes around it, and cite it. And that gets us to the next form of plagiarism, which is that anything that you're bringing over from somebody else, quote or paraphrasing, that you need to cite, that you cite it, that you provide the necessary citation, and in that citation, a second point, you provide the information and in the right format as required by the style guide that you're using. And I'm going to touch on that again in just a moment. Your citation should refer to a reference. And so for every citation, you should have a reference. And if the reference is not there, again, that is plagiarism. And like citations, the references need to adhere to whatever style guide you're following. It needs to contain the right information and be in the right format according to the style guide. And if either the citations or the references do not adhere to the style guide that you're following, then that also is plagiarism. And so now I want to talk to you about, with those examples in mind of what plagiarism looks like, I want to talk about what specifically editing does and how we approach editing with the rules and guidelines that I've established for my company and the editors who work for me, not only to avoid creating plagiarism, but also to identify it and to guide our clients in eliminating it from our papers, from the papers that we edit for them. And so we look at that in two ways. We look at it in terms of content and we look at it in terms of style. And so in terms of content, what we're looking at is that you've got your ideas in your paper and we will not add to them. Ultimately, plagiarism is a question of who is the owner of what work or what components of the paper. And so when we're talking about providing a citation or a reference to a source that you've used, that's giving acknowledgement or acknowledging the owner of that content. Okay, but if you're getting something edited and somebody has written something for you or written content for your paper and you don't give that person credit, then that is plagiarism. And a great example of how this can come up is, let's say, for example, you're going to provide 3 arguments or 3 points to support your argument for something. And your first point is fully developed, your second point is fully developed, and your third point is either missing or not there. So what we will not do, because we're not going to create plagiarism in your paper, is we're not going to go ahead and add that third point in there. We're not going to flesh it out. But with our editing and feedback service, with our feedback, we'll go ahead and tell you, hey, look at your first point and look at your second point. You don't have your third point, so either change the text that precedes it to say that you're only going to mention 2 points instead of 3, or add in the third point. Similarly, if your third point is underdeveloped compared to your first and second point, we'll say, hey, look at your third point. You've got your first point is developed in this manner, your second point is developed in this manner. What you need to do here on your third point is develop it in this manner so that it can stand up to your first and second points. And so that's one of the rules that we have, is that we will not add content or concepts or ideas to your paper in our editing. We will give you a note or a comment or feedback to that effect with our editing and feedback service. Secondly, comes the question of style, which includes both voice and adhering to a style guide. And certain style guides dictate the kind of voice or writing style that should be used in the paper. And so when we look at a paper, I mentioned earlier about how paraphrasing may not fit into the overall voice of the paper depending on how the paraphrasing is done. We're not going to go through a paraphrase section or your paraphrasing and rewrite it for you to fit your voice. If you've got an established voice in your paper and your paraphrasing doesn't fit that wholeheartedly, we're going to tell you, hey, look, you've got to fix this paraphrasing, you've got to rewrite it. Now, where we will make adjustments to voice, because again, like with the paraphrasing, we're not going to go through and overhaul the voice in your paper, but if we see a couple of points, little points here and there, where you've got a clearly established voice through the paper, but you've done something different in a couple of these places where it doesn't align with your voice, you've used an odd word choice or an odd sentence structure that doesn't fit with the rest, and it's not a situation where you're paraphrasing or quoting from somebody, then we will go ahead and recommend a modification, and we'll indicate to you specifically what that modification is. We'll make that correction. Which brings me to my final point, which is how we make our corrections. And what we do when we're making our corrections is we use the track changes feature of Microsoft Word. What that does is that indicates the correction, the specific correction to be made, but it is not a final, does not represent a final change to the document. Making it a final change to the document is on your side, on your shoulders to do. And it comes back to that basic issue of plagiarism, which is ownership of the content. And so what we want to do is when we're making our recommendations to you, we want you to take the step of taking personal ownership of those changes. And that can come in one of three ways. So we recommend a correction, and we want you to look at that and evaluate it. You may decide that you don't like that correction, that you actually prefer the way you had it without our editing. That's fine. You reject our recommendation, and then that is the step that you're taking. You adhere to the original content, you're taking ownership of that original wording. Something else that could happen, we recommend a correction, and while you don't necessarily agree with the correction that we're making, you see the problem that we've highlighted through our recommendation, and you think of something else to put instead. So you come up with your own solution to the problem that we've identified. That's great. You are taking personal ownership of that correction. And then finally, maybe you think through it and you're like, hey, look, the correction that they've recommended is the best one, and I want to go ahead and incorporate that into my document. The action of accepting that change into your document is one of taking personal ownership of that change and making that change your own. I hope that helps clarify the question for you. Feel free to reach out to us with any particular concerns you have. You can see our full range of paper editing services, or academic editing services, really, from proofreading to editing and feedback. www.dlaeditors.com.